Welcome to the first of the 2021 CPI ANZOG Reimagining Government webinar series on Failing Forward. My name is Shubho Banerjee. I'm the Deputy CEO at ANZOG, and it's my very great pleasure to be your facilitator for the webinar today. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands on which we're all dialing in from today, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present, and any other Aboriginal elders with us today. I'm speaking to you from Canberra, where the traditional owners are the Ngunnawal people. And to our friends in New Zealand, Ena mana, Ena reo, Ena karangatanga maya, tēnā katoa. It's great that you could all join us. I had the good fortune of being involved in the Reimagining Government series last year. It was a really exciting, fantastic set of conversations, and we're really looking forward to launching those again this year with this session. We have a fantastic panel that has joined us today. I'll start by introducing them to you. Andy Mervis is a program manager at the Centre for Public Impact in North America, where she leads programs that work to build innovation capacity in local governments. Welcome, Andy. Tina Waller serves as Director of Innovation and Performance for the City of Seattle, leading a talented and committed multidisciplinary team that works closely with city departments to solve problems. Welcome, Tina. And Peter Shergold is the Chancellor of Western Sydney University and a former head of the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet here in Canberra. Welcome, Peter. So to get us underway today, we're going to do a little poll just to have a little bit of audience participation to get us started. We're about to open that poll to everyone. It will have 4 questions in it, and we're looking for your feedback, and we'll use that to guide the start of our chat with the participants. Now, just before I open the poll, I will just do a little bit of housekeeping. We have a lot of participants on the call, which is fantastic. So if people could stay on mute and with their video off, that will reduce the bandwidth requirements for everyone. We are recording the session, and it will be available afterwards through a website that we will send you the link for. We invite people to tweet using the hashtag #ReimagineGov, and we invite people to contribute comments and questions on the chat throughout the session. So on mute, video off through the session, and then you will also have the chance through a breakout session to get involved and to have a conversation with people. And of course, at that stage, unmute, get your video on, have a chat to people. So let's get underway. If we could open the quick poll. There are 4 questions in the poll, and we're keen for your feedback on the poll. Question 1, in your experience, how do governments currently view failure? Question 2, what does it mean for governments to fail forward? Question 3, can you give some examples of governments who are practicing a failing forward approach? And question D, what do you see as being the main barriers to failing forward, and how might we begin to address these? So I'll just give people a minute to respond. Thank you very much for such a great response rate there. Terrific start to proceedings. So option C, can you give some examples of governments who are practicing a failing forward approach, is the winner. And then option D is second, what do you see as being the main barriers? And so we'll start the conversation with the panel accordingly. Perhaps Andy, you could kick us off with some examples from CPI's work with regard to some examples of governments who are practicing a failing forward approach.
Hi there. Thank you so much for the opportunity to join everyone today. It's such a privilege, so I'm just so excited to be part of this conversation. I'm also really excited to share out some examples of governments that I think are doing a great job modeling a fail forward approach. And before I dig into those specific examples, I might just take a pause and highlight what it is that I think failing forward actually looks like in these organizations. We think that failing forward looks like the ability to identify problems that are happening, talk about those challenges or setbacks, learn from them, and understand what is or isn't going well, and then actually doing something about what you're learning along the way to either make a change in real time or ensure that that learning gets put to good use in the future. And so any city example or government example that I talk about will kind of embody these 4 steps that we think are really important to failing forward. The first example that I want to give is in the city of Boston, Massachusetts. The city of Boston has an organization called the Office of New Urban Mechanics. And essentially what that is a innovation hub, an innovation department that kind of creates space for other departments in the city, the municipal city government, to try out new ideas in a kind of safe way. And so what that looks like is partnering, say, for example, with the health department to try out a new idea for potentially like a rotating or a moving around van that can help residents who are experiencing homelessness. But what works really well about Monum is a couple key things. The first is that they are known to be kind of the innovation hub in Boston. And so it provides some of the other departments who may not have the same kind of public leeway to try new things and get them wrong, a little bit more space to learn and iterate than they normally would get. And so partnering with something that is kind of known to be the experimentation wing really helps to kind of foster innovation more broadly in the city ecosystem. Another example that I might want to share is with the Innovation Center of the Finnish National Agency for Education. And I mentioned them because I think they have a really innovative model for trying new things. They're a national hub, but they work with municipal governments to bring together a wide range of stakeholders, parents, teachers, principals, and even students to identify failures that they see in their system, in their school system, and co-learn and collaborate together to try out a new idea. But it's more than just kind of talking about problems and trying out something new. They have such an iterative model to learning where they meet almost weekly or bi-weekly to talk about not just what isn't going well, but also, or not just what is going well, but also what isn't going well, and trying to learn and make adjustments along the way. And we think that this really iterative approach to learning is really what makes failing forward so exciting. It's not just waiting until the end and seeing how something goes, but really being intentional about evaluating the strengths and the challenges along the way.
Thanks very much, Andy. That's a great explanation, both of the specifics of some of the initiatives, but also some of the process requirements around it. How do we make it work in practice? And how do we have the right conversations to support it? Tina, perhaps we could go to you next. You're involved in some specific initiatives in Seattle. It would be fantastic to hear about the detail of some of those.
Yes. Well, and I just have to say I'm so excited to be here and to join in this conversation, because we found here in Seattle that failing forward has been the name of the game, particularly with the last year. We, in the United States at least, we were the epicenter, the first epicenter in the United States of the COVID pandemic. And so what we found was we had to lean into innovating every day and experimenting every day and getting comfortable with not knowing what would happen and not knowing if we would land a success or if we would fail. But we did go in with a shared sort of mental model around knowing what we were seeking to do, having a clear plan for that, and then ensuring that we had a culture of learning and growth so that if something failed, we could talk about it and still glean some insights and then go on our day. There's one example I'd love to give that is in the news today, and in a moment I can even put a link in the chat for my friends in Australia and New Zealand if you're interested in learning more. But here's one example of in Seattle of how we fail forward and how we think about that. So we have a public utility here in Seattle where we are lucky enough to have built 3 dams on a river just outside of Seattle. And those 3 dams provide clean, renewable energy to Seattle residents. It accounts for a little less than half of the power needs that Seattle has. Right now we're going through the process of getting those dams reapproved for another 50 years. But we encountered, my colleagues at the utility encountered some issues because the river is an important habitat for salmon that have become endangered. And those salmon are important for our resident orcas. We have orcas in the Seattle area, and they are endangered. And so we have realized that these dams have environmental impacts, and we realized that we weren't doing a good job of engaging our tribal partners whose land we sit upon and for whom the salmon is very important. And so we found ourselves in a pickle because we were rushing through this process without having the intentional and thoughtful conversations with all these stakeholders that we needed to have. And we failed spectacularly. We failed in a very American way, which meant that we got terrible press coverage. And what we did to react to that was take a couple steps back, reflect and think about what we got wrong, and then really lean in with intentionality. We changed our approach. We did a lot of listening. And in doing so, we think what we are hearing from our tribal partners is that we've rebuilt some of that trust. But I'll share that as an initial example of what Failing Forward here in Seattle has looked like. And again, lots of examples from our experience with coronavirus.
Thanks very much, Tina. Let me throw to you, Peter. I'm interested both in some examples that you might have in the Australian context of failing forward type approaches, but then I'm also keen for you to push from that to, of course, you wrote the significant report, Learning from Failure, and that talked about some of the barriers in practice, particularly in an Australian Westminster system, for trying to do these sorts of approaches at scale, whether they're at the state level or at the national level. So perhaps a couple of examples, Peter, and then transition us a little bit more into why this is hard in practice for public servants in particular.
Yes, no problem. So I did write that report called Learning from Failure. It's available online from anyone who's interested for the Commonwealth Government. It was about a couple of major projects which had failed. In fact, tragically failed in terms of the home insulation program, where a number of young people died because of putting in the cladding in a faulty way. But I then became increasingly interested. I was invited to talk to the Dutch Public Service, and I turned up at The Hague to give the presentation on learning from failure. And I was very excited because there were all these posters everywhere saying "fuck up night." And I thought, well, this is really, the Dutch are really out there promoting my work. I was very disappointed when I found that it was another venue within the same convention hall. But what I discovered then is fuck up nights happen in 81 countries at the moment. And in fact, I had the courage to introduce the very first one in Canberra, Australia, for public servants. And it is getting across that idea that we need to learn from failure, not just individually, which is how this started 20 years ago with a motivational speaker called John Maxwell. Much interests me more is how we can fail forward organisationally. And it's very, very tough in a political environment. And I think there is a couple of reasons. First of all, although in the public sector, programs and services tend to change frequently, the underlying ethos of public service, particularly, but not exclusively in the Westminster situation, is pretty well structured, and it is actually relatively difficult to break out of the box. You need to do things differently. And of course, it's also difficult because although we as public servants might take a bit of a knockback if we are associated with mistakes or failure, it's much tougher for the political masters that we serve, ministers or chief ministers who can see themselves removed from office on the basis of failure. So my starting point is we have got to learn organisationally how we can convince politicians, along with ourselves, of how we need risk in order to innovate, but we can manage that risk. And my own view is that means we need to embrace in public services, much more than politicians like to do, the concept of experimentation and demonstration and pilot. Now, I don't know how it is in other countries around the world. I can only talk for the APS, the Australian Public Service. I reckon this is true. Every time you want to introduce a new program and Treasury or Finance won't give you the money. They'll only give you 1/10 of what you ask for. You put it out and you call it a demonstration project. And the problem with that is it's not really a demonstration program. It's just saying we can't afford the whole thing. We've got to be serious about being willing to experiment and start small. And as our other speakers have said, being willing to evaluate and monitor from day one, and then being willing to, you know, adapt as we go, or even fail. Yeah, fail early. So I think that's what we need to do within the environment within which we operate.
Thanks, Peter. Tina, I'm going to go back to you. I'm interested in hard conversations. I want to get to where this was really difficult. And you mentioned on the way through one of the initiatives where there was a lot of noise, there was adverse press coverage. I guess I want to go to a leader in your space who is skeptical and who found that very difficult. And I'm interested in how to approach from where you are with responsibility for initiatives, a leader who is skeptical, rather than having the conversation about leaders who are positive or really want to do it and really want to embrace risk. I really want to get to people that are highly attuned to this could end my career. How do you have that conversation? And is that something that you've had in Seattle? Is there something you could tell us about that?
That's a great question, and yes, and as Peter said, I think Peter sort of very articulately sort of honed in on elected officials. It's riskier for them. It feels riskier for them, right? I think one thing that I found, and something I try to do every time I engage either with the elected that I work for, the mayor, or with members of our legislature, is anytime I talk to them about good news, a success, I weave in the failures that we encountered on the way to that success, to underscore that baked into every success that you see, whether it's government or in the private sector, that success is the result of a lot of failures. And one example that when I've had new electeds come in, new mayors, I often just show them my iPhone. So Apple makes this great phone. It's fantastic. Many of you probably have one. And I would venture to say that none of you have the original iPhone, right? And that is because they have continuously innovated, they've experimented, and they're on, I don't even know what number, honestly, what model they're on. But as residents, as citizens, we all expect to be every couple of years to have a new iPhone come out and to get the latest and greatest technology. And yet we don't have that same expectation with government. We don't have the same expectation that government is constantly experimenting and iterating and maybe failing along the way. And so again, with a more skeptical elected official, I find that when it's time to, when I'm able to engage with them and tell them about some good work, I always bake into there the fact that, well, this is the result of, we tried 4 different things and failed miserably, but here's what we've learned. And here's why those failures were so important, because it taught us, do this, not that. Go to this location, not the other one. And so I think by baking that in and making it a regular part of how we engage, it can help to sort of plant those seeds for electeds, but then also for those that work under us to be able to see and appreciate. And every success there's failure baked in. I would also say, as an additional tactic, if you will, that I've used, there's nothing like peer pressure, which may be funny to mention, but oftentimes if I'm with the mayor that I work for, who has leaned in a lot to the idea of rapid innovation and experimentation, if I've if there are times where maybe she's not as receptive to an idea, if I'm able to point to other cities who are trying an idea, or better yet, our friends in Australia and New Zealand, maybe they've already tried this and they're way ahead of us. Peer pressure is a healthy way to normalize trying things out for the first time, trying them when we don't have a full blueprint and crystal ball. So those are 2 ideas that I'd share.
Thanks very much, Tina. That's very practical and helpful advice. I'm going to go to you again, Andy. But firstly, on the way there, one of the themes of reimagining government is to think about complicated problems, to think about complex problems and think about system approaches, and how all those concepts interrelate in public policy and public administration. And one of the things that came through very strongly last year was the things that we're trying to do here are very hard. And by definition, we actually don't know the answer. So this kind of conceptual point that if we knew the answer, we'd broadly be doing it. Experimentation is actually a fundamental kind of conceptual point here, that you're trying to get closer to the answer. But that's actually still a not so linear way of thinking about problem solving that's very difficult in conventional public administration, and certainly difficult in the Australian context, I think. So this idea that we know in our minds that we need to do experimentation because the stuff is hard, but then we don't really have still the supporting infrastructure, processes, culture to allow that, I think is a big gap, and it's something that we'll be talking about throughout this series this year as well. Andy, I'm going to go back to you. I'm interested in this idea of scale and thinking about, as Peter said, the absolutely essential point that we pilot and demonstrate and do things at a manageable scale to start with. But then this issue that often those pilots are, let's say, local leadership driven in a positive sense, you know, that their success depends on having fantastic local leaders, but that makes them intrinsically hard to scale up. So to get between kind of very local to anything even citywide or statewide or national is very difficult. So in your work at CPI, have you been thinking about this scaling issue and how you get from really interesting local level experimentation to things that might be system-wide?
That's a great question. I think when it comes to thinking about scaling and failing forward or learning from failure, and how you take the kind of reality that oftentimes some of the best innovations work so well because of the people that support them and the people who, you know, actually know the community to actually make the change. I think that's a great point, that it can be really difficult to think about how you replicate that in other places. I think I would challenge the idea or the assumption that just because something does work in one place, that there is necessarily a great chance that it will work elsewhere, particularly when it comes to the specific ideas of a program in particular. Because communities are so different and their needs are so different, at least in the US context, but I'd imagine that's true elsewhere, that it's necessarily a given that might happen. I think one thing that I would say is, if you look at things from a fail forward approach, understanding the lessons of a pilot or a program and understanding both what the drivers are, what made those specific local innovators so successful, or what were the setbacks that the initial team experienced initially, as a way to kind of maximize the chances of success is really important. So thinking about this almost from the perspective of a playbook, and understanding how is this kind of played out the first time, what drove it to be more successful, what drove it to be less successful, and navigating that as a way to kind of encourage others to take those kind of bare bones and build it up for themselves in their own local context, I think is kind of the approach that I would suggest there, particularly with an eye towards being honest about what wasn't working the first time, because there's no point in rebuilding a ship if you already know kind of what the flaws are.
Yeah, that's great advice, Andy. Thanks very much. Back to you, Peter. I'm interested in this idea of, you obviously did a lot of work in Canberra and headed the civil service here. You had quite a bit to say when you were head of PM&C about, if I could say, devolution at scale, how you think about local decision making, but while sitting at the head of a very large system. And I know that you've done a lot of work subsequently as well with this idea of a balance between thinking about whole of system rules, but then local decision making and accountability. Would you like to talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, sure, because I've been doing a lot of thinking about how to do this. Part of it is, in a sense, re-emphasising what my fellow panellists have already said. My view is, in a sense, the bigger you think, the smaller you start. The advantage of that is that you can then start fast. Public servants, if you're not careful, love to have endless committees and interdepartmental committees and think of everything that can go wrong, which is great. But at a certain stage, you have to realize that a lot of public administration is learning from doing. So think big, start small, and then start to roll out. More importantly, we know that in fact, although governments tend to run out programs nationally or at the state level, in fact, it can be much more effective if you tailor those programs to specific communities. Refugees, for example, or Aboriginal Australians, or if you tailor them to particular places. The advantage of experimentation, for example, even if you're thinking of a bigger program, you can say, well, let's trial this in 4 different communities, an urban setting, a regional setting, etc., and find out what works. We've got the opportunity to do that, as long as we realize that you don't evaluate at the end of a 3-year program. You evaluate as you start up this program and are then able to adapt and tailor, sort out problems, and then only when you're ready, roll up and scale out. So that's really, I think, important. The challenge in part is helping the politicians we serve be able to articulate this. So starting small is one thing, but I think being honest in narrative is another. Now, it's a bit bizarre, of course, because public servants tend to work behind the scenes and we look to politicians to create the narrative. I think we've got to help. Let me just give one example. It's a New South Wales example, and it was with Premier Barry O'Farrell. And I had managed to persuade the Premier to do something which was a first off in Australia, which was to introduce social impact bonds. And it was risky. We hadn't done it in Australia before. And so we talked about how do you present this to the media and to the public? And he did it, and we talked about this, but he did it brilliantly. First of all, he said, well, we're going to do this in an area where we've got 30 years of public policy failure. And everybody knows this. So we started it in the area of trying to reduce the extent to which, tragically, young people were having to put in out-of-home care because of the failure of their families and their parents. And different governments of different persuasions had tried a whole lot of programs. And he was able to say, look, I've got to tell you, none of that has really worked. So it's time for us to take a risk and do something different. And I'm going to introduce this new program where the government will pay on the basis of results, but we will do it through a not-for-profit community organisation to deliver the service, and they will then go to the market to raise private funds, so a 3-sector collaboration. And what I think Premier O'Farrell did well, he said, look, I don't know where it's going to work, but we're going to start small. We're going to start with a couple. If they work, then we're going to roll out more, but we will wait for a couple of years. Now, I've got to say, and it isn't just because those first impact bonds worked well, even if they had failed, I think he had done a good job of setting the political expectations around that. And I think that's, so it's starting small and having a clear and honest narrative. Those, I think, are the first 2 steps if we want to move from pilots and demonstrations to much larger rollout, albeit, I hope, a rollout which will still tailor programs to particular places and particular communities.
Thanks, Peter. Going back to you, Tina, I'm interested in continuing this strand of conversation, but perhaps with the word entrepreneurialism in our mind. This idea that I certainly learnt from a colleague, a private sector colleague, who said that the idea of a startup venture is that you get to a point where you convince yourself that you might have a good idea, and then you have to jump. Like you actually can't stand on the side of the pool until such time as you know everything that you need to know. And my friend and colleague's argument with me was the structures of government are actually biased towards finding holes in things, particularly in many ways the rigorous and good processes of cabinet governance are about finding holes in things, but in fact, experimentation is about knowing enough and then jumping. And so I'm interested in your experience at Seattle about jumping, trying a few different things, what that looks like, how you deal with this idea that you probably don't have quite enough information when you start. But as Peter's saying, it's intrinsic to the process that you're learning about it as you go. Tina?
That's a great question, and I'll share. In Seattle, there have been a number of times during my tenure where I looked around and said, oh, okay, this is all the information I have. It's not a ton, but I have a window of opportunity, sort of the holes in the bureaucracy that you mentioned, use your words. So I just have to close my eyes, have faith, and jump. And sometimes it's worked well. The parachutes come out and it's worked well. Other times it's felt like a splat on the sidewalk. But I'll share one thought in terms of what to do with incomplete information, and how do you then remain entrepreneurial and have a bias for action. Our work in Seattle is we try to balance between sort of being under the radar and just keeping a steady drumbeat of analysis and work to continuously build our understanding around a given issue, area, or problem. We also try to balance that with showing our work and not just going into a hole for 2 years, because unlike our peers in Apple who have iterated on the iPhone, we can't afford to do that, right? We are not a true R&D lab. We have to be delivering for residents. So I'll give you one example. And this has failure in it, and now we're trying something new. So maybe I can come back later in the year and tell you how we did. But it was probably 4 years ago. We in the city of Seattle were seeing an uptick, an increase in crime, specifically related to youth who were getting involved in crime. And when we looked at the data, it was clear that there were certain races of young people who were disproportionately represented in this crime data. And so we set out to understand, well, what is it that is needed within the community to provide maybe more pro-social activities, or to just try to calm things down, right? We were thinking about it very superficially. But then when we went and talked to young people themselves, we very quickly learned, as I'm sure all of the folks on this line got to a lot faster than us, it's so much deeper, right? And for us, the question was, well, we cannot undo the last 15 to 20 years of poverty and of hardship. But what we can do is try to figure out what can we change from this point moving forward. So we did some analysis, and we brought in an evidence-based model for intervening in violence, and it's had great success in other cities like Boston, I believe, as Andy was referencing earlier. And so we said, well, this worked other places, it can work here. So we gave it a shot. We did a good old demonstration project for 2 years, and it failed. It didn't work. These young people didn't get what they needed. Crime remained an issue, a challenge. Okay, so we didn't figure that out. We had taken 2 years to try to tackle that. Now, we still had, we had gleaned some insights through that 2 years, but we still had some incomplete information. And some of the folks on this line may, if you follow the American news, you know that last summer and last year, really, the United States had a major reckoning around policing and police use of force. And it was during that time of turmoil, tension, of distress, that we went out and we just started talking to community members and started connecting some dots. Folks who were out in the streets protesting were telling us, listen, police to you represent public safety, but we do not feel safe. And what we did was, for government, we zipped it and we just listened. And we made space for community members to have their voice heard. And we are now trying something new based on what we heard. We just put out a procurement for $10 million to explore what does it mean to create community safety for young people in Seattle? What does that look like? How should we measure success? And we very much put it out. This procurement is out right now, and community-based organizations can respond and tell us what that means to them. They get to tell us how they would measure that. And for a lot of us, right, government, we measure outcomes, we measure the key indicators. But what we're trying in this instance is to invite our residents to say, well, what is it that matters to you? And how do you think we should be analyzing this problem? And so I share this one example as an example of where we had incomplete information, and let's be honest, we don't have that lived experience. So we turned it over to our residents and invited them into co-design. And what's so great there is that also helps to build trust and helps to build faith that, listen, we don't pretend to have all the answers. We want to listen and learn, and then let's work together to iterate moving forward. So I'm excited to see where that goes. But that's one example top of mind that I'll share.
Thanks, Tina. And I think it really goes in a quite profound way to how we think about information in government processes, where it comes from, the distributed nature of information, understanding problems in a different way. And I think that's a really fantastic example. We're going to break in 3 minutes to go into some breakout groups. But Andy, I'm just keen for one quick comment from you. It's a very big question, so it's not fair to say that you could necessarily answer it in the next couple of minutes, but it might set up some interesting conversations in the breakout groups. One of the things in the CPI work that I've been really struck by is a greater kind of depth of understanding of different types of mistakes. Not all mistakes are the same. And failing forward is not some sort of blank check for saying, well, hey, mistakes are just fine. And so really trying to understand the difference between what you could reasonably have known and acted upon, what you couldn't reasonably have known, which is this information point, how you process it and how you learn over time, strikes me as at the heart of failing forward. But it really comes to a kind of interrogation that different types of mistakes matter. Andy, could you give us a couple of minutes on that on the way to the breakout group?
Absolutely. I love this question. It is a very big question. I think the first thing that I would say about this is that mistakes build on each other, right? And I think the culture that supports, or the culture that undergirds how people talk about the smaller mistakes, the everyday mistakes and failures, or even kind of the mishaps in piloting, when you kind of try to control as many of the circumstances around a pilot as you can, so that it ends up seeming successful and you ultimately are able to fund it more broadly. The same cultures that kind of impede talking about everyday mistakes and failures or challenges and problems in pilots, that same culture is really the kind of culture that ultimately leads to the massive disasters or the massive systemic government failures. It's the same kind of idea that we don't talk about the bad things or the problems that ultimately gets you into long-running systemic issues in government. And I think that this really resonates, particularly in the US, when it comes to issues around racial justice, where there really are so many failures in the status quo of US governing. But it's hard to kind of talk about what those are because you don't have the cultures that really enable you to have those hard conversations. And that all really builds on each other and ultimately comes to a head in really disastrous ways. So that's kind of the first thing that I would say. I think when it comes to what really is the difference between a smaller mistake, almost inconsequential mistake, and a public disaster is actually really all about learning. And what is the process of learning that you're doing all along that kind of spectrum of challenges or mistakes that can help you to kind of avoid that bigger problem. So a mistake that maybe happens, it sets an operation back by a day or two as kind of a problem that maybe harms a pilot or a service provision or something, but ultimately is fixed and that kind of lesson is learned all across an organization or potentially beyond that organization. If that lesson is learned, is that ultimately actually a mistake? Or is that kind of a positive thing that ultimately leads to something more positive more broadly? And I think that that's something that And government is not particularly adept at doing that, of taking those kinds of failures and learning from them rather than kind of continuing to shove them under the rug. But that kind of learning, that cross-functional learning and informational sharing, is really important ultimately, I think, to breaking down those, reducing the likelihood of major disasters or systemic failures.
Thank you very much to the group that I was able to join. Really fascinating conversation. I hope the introverts had a good cup of tea, and I hope we've got everyone back now. We've got about 20 minutes now to follow up some of those issues. So start posting into the chat, and we'll try and take up some of those issues as we go. But just to take one from the group that I was able to sit in on, Peter, I'm keen to talk to you about courage, I think, and this idea that it's all very well to talk about going to your minister with a sense of all the ways in which you've learnt from a program. I think the lived reality is that if it hasn't gone well, and if you have just been smashed at estimates, that is not a pleasant conversation to be having at any stage. I wonder about how you would advise people in having those conversations. What does courage look like under those circumstances? And how do you square away the kind of quest for learning that we've been talking about here with the absolute undeniable pragmatic reality that short-term failure is highly unpopular and highly difficult for people to process in terms of their careers? Peter?
Yeah, it's a great question. And look, as I say, I think failing forward is both individual and organisational. And it is true that I think it's important that individuals do take their personal responsibility for where they have contributed to organisational failure. I think that's an important part of answerability and responsibility. But I think it's also important, of course, to look back on the failure and think, oh, it's not just this made me stronger and more resilient. Actually, I and the organisations I work for will now learn from this. Courage, well, of course it turns courage. I've, done lots of Senate estimates and facing, very appropriately inquiring parliamentarians. And I faced, on occasions, appropriately angry ministers about things that go wrong. I think the key with a minister is to be able to identify in advance what can go wrong. The difficulty is we often tend to do that by avoiding risk rather than working on the basis of risk and how we are going to manage that. Because if we don't do that, the biggest risk of all is the risk of doing nothing. That it may be less visible for a few years, but it does not make for good public policy or good social impact. So I think it is having those private discussions that you have with ministers and explaining how you want to go about this. Now, on Thursday, I will be facing this myself with the Premier of New South Wales, Gladys Berejiklian, because I'm just bringing out a report to which the government is responding to on how to reimagine vocational education in the state. It's got a couple of really very big ideas. Why I've been able to, I think, gain political support from that is that I've been able to say to the Premier and the ministers, look, these are big ideas and things can go wrong here. But let's therefore start straight away, not spend another 18 months thinking about this. But for example, it will involve two quite big ideas. The first is establishing a quite new form of tertiary institution in Australia, which actually integrates practical and theoretical learning. And the second is for the first time in Australia to introduce a careers network for people 15 to 60. So they're big ideas. What I've been able to do is to persuade the Premier, look, these are perfect ideas to start out on a relatively small scale. And I assure you that we can then learn and manage the risks required. Yes, it still takes political courage to do it, but although political leaders tend to be nervous about these things, you know, good political leaders also want to drive change. And we need to say to a minister, a premier, a prime minister, we understand the change that you want to bring about. Here are some big ideas to do it, but we can manage this in a way which reduces the risk, gives you 9/10 of the benefit, but reduces at least half of the risk involved. That's how I would go about it, Shubo.
Thanks, Peter. Be very interested to see your vet report, of course.
I know. And so don't go public in the next 24 hours, or I will certainly be learning from failure.
Tina, I'm going to move to you. And again, I'm going to use a big word, well, a loaded word, which is trust. I'm interested in taking from Peter's intervention that there's a degree of trust required in the advising conversation that shows that you understand the challenge at stake and that you understand it in its full dimension. You know, that you're not, in that sense, a wonk, just looking at a kind of neat way to try and solve something with a systems approach, but that you understand what is at stake here. You understand what is at stake for people on the ground, but you also understand some of the pragmatic realities of governing. And that's a very high trust conversation. How do you go about that kind of conversation in your role?
With a lot of preparation. I think to that point, if you're doing, it's my point of view, if you're doing a good job of sort of advising up and managing up, you do your homework. And if something's failed, you don't go straight to the boss. You have some conversations, for example, with key stakeholders whose perspectives your elected official or politician cares about, and so that you can bring to that conversation, so here's what has happened, we have failed, want to share with you, here's how others are seeing it. If you're able to, for example, highlight, and this is pulling from my Seattle experience, but here, if we try something and fail, we have a community of technologists, for example. We have a very active tech sector that has really allowed our economy to flourish, and being able to point to folks in that industry and say, sort of, we're getting props and kudos from those who are engaged in innovation on the technology side, that should serve to sort of shore up or placate, if you will, that's not the right word, but at least get some comfort for the elected of what the decision or what the situation is. But trust is also built on honesty and candor and being able to own up to what hasn't worked and doing so quickly so you don't stew in it too long. I found myself with a previous mayor, once I could look this gentleman in the eye and say, yeah, we tried that and screwed up. It didn't work. So now I'm here to talk to you about what we're going to do to fix it. And I think in that moment, being able to acknowledge it, name it, and then go back into problem solving mode with a proposed approach, or being able to highlight, here's what we got wrong and here's what we're going to do about it, ensures that, again, being able to prepare and think ahead so that those considerations that an elected official has in their mind, you can help to sort of ameliorate or de-intensify any anxiety that they have. So that's
thanks, Tina, and that certainly resonates with my experience. In Peter's report, he actually talked a lot about paying proper attention to basics and getting that right. And your point that preparation really matters. And this could literally be in any public administration, public policy conversation. The idea that you come forward with identified problems and a way to take it forward, it is so basic and yet so essential in this conversation. You cannot just come forward and say, well, here are all the potential risks, and if I fail, don't blame me. You've got to come with a sense of, here's what we're going to do about them. And this is why it's worth doing. This is why it's worth taking the risk. And I think those are very, they are basics of public service craft, but they are incredibly important and really interesting to hear you say that, Tina, and Peter, certainly a big part of your report as well. Andy, can I go back to you? One of the comments in the chat, and by the way, please get on the chat. If you've got questions, I'm happy to take them forward to the panel for you. Andy, I'm going to go back to you, and one of the comments on the chat was perhaps as we work through COVID and get through to perhaps a next phase of COVID, things feel more fluid, that there is more chance to move at speed, experiment and try different things. Is that your experience through CPI in this way?
Absolutely. I think that COVID has broken down so many of the barriers that we first identified when we conducted the Fail Forward research. I think that COVID has basically ensured failure and kind of made it clear that failure is not just inevitable, it's probably going to happen tomorrow and the next week, because there are so many uncertainties in the United States. And I think particularly at the local level, when local governments were asked to really do infinitely more work, meet kind of more infinitely more complex challenges. And I think they did a really brilliant job tackling those head on, but kind of embracing the fact that failure and trying new things is kind of a requirement of the new world that we lived in. And I'll give an example because I think it really highlights how things have changed. One of the cities that we worked with is Little Rock, Arkansas, and we were talking to I guess when we were there and we were learning from them what their barriers are to learning from failure, they said a really big barrier that we have is this mindset that nothing's ever going to change. And it's so pervasive, the mindset, that it makes it really impossible to try new things, because you feel like you almost have to convince people that trying a new thing is possible, not even allowed, just possible. But what they found, or what we heard, is that after COVID, everything had to be new. And both the way that you interact with people, whether that's on Slack or Teams, or emailing more regularly in a way that you could just kind of show up in someone's office, or interacting with residents, had to have a new approach. And a really good example of that is when they were trying to make sure that they had an accurate census count. The US Census happened this summer. And normally they would do door knocking and knock on people's doors to do count, but you obviously can't do that in a global pandemic. And so what they kind of, I guess they knocked and people didn't want to open the door because they didn't feel safe, which makes sense. And so they kind of tried this for a couple months. It wasn't working. They weren't hitting their numbers. And ultimately they realized, well, why don't we just meet people where they are? And so they were able to go to areas where food was being distributed for folks who were having economic need and count folks that way. And little things like that, which seem super intuitive now, would have seemed much, much harder before the pandemic, because it would involve not following protocol, doing something really different than they had done for the past 10 years of doing the census count, in the past decades, I should say. And that kind of thing, we think, has truly blossomed and ballooned in local governments in particular in the wake of COVID.
Thanks very much, Andy. A couple of things from the comments that I'll pick up, and then I'll ask for final comments from our panelists before we close. But one, there was a terrific comment from Ben Briggs about the importance of knowledge sharing, conversations in knowledge groups, and having that in a lower key, non-threatening way, and then being able to come back to public policy issues with a sense of, well, we had a conversation, this is what we heard, what do you think of it? I'm a big supporter of that, and I actually think these sorts of seminars are an important part of sharing knowledge and having a conversation. And it gives me an excuse to plug the community of practice that I'll plug at the end of the seminar, as well as a way of continuing that conversation. So thanks, Ben. And Belinda Josie had, I think, a very good point around, of course, the essential difference between public and private operation. And I think we were all struck, Tina, by the iPhone example, but there also is the sense that failures along the way from Apple are in many ways less consequential as long as they get the blockbuster at the end. And one of the articles on the website, the microsite that's been set up for this conversation, makes that point, that successive innovations from corporates are steps on the journey towards a blockbuster, whereas I think for public sector, partly because of universality of service in many ways, there's a different kind of pressure, and I think that's super interesting as well. So thank you very much for the comments there. I'm just going to run one last time around the panel to see if there are any final thoughts, and then I'll close. So Tina, any final thoughts from you from Seattle?
Yeah, one closing thought, and Andy's statement, comments that she just shared brought this to top of mind for me. I'm going to share, because now we've spent enough time together on this webinar where we're all friends. And I'm going to just share with you an anxiety I'm having, everyone. And I want you to give me any advice you can, but I have a worry. And my worry is that as we begin to get folks vaccinated and transmission goes down on COVID, I am worried that the switch, as we return to normal, I am worried that our new normal will not include this passion for and this necessity for experimentation. And I'm worried about that here in Seattle, but everywhere. And so to help me manage my anxiety, I want everybody on this webinar to lean into bringing, like keeping that fire for experimentation and failing forward alive, because it would be such a shame if when we have to go back into offices, where in the United States we haven't been for a year, right? As we go back into those old environments, I don't want us to go back to the way we worked. So that's what I'll leave everyone with.
Thanks so much, Tina. Andy?
Yeah, I think I certainly echo Tina's anxiety and her desire for sustained change. I think one thing that I'll say is you talked a lot about leadership in this webinar, but I also think a really important aspect of this is the team level, and the folks who are on frontline, who are kind of working on the front line or in the middle management level, and really thinking about how can they promote learning from failure in their sphere of influence. And I think that there really is ample opportunity for that. Leadership is super important, but I think that there are really important ways that folks all across the hierarchy of government can promote learning from failure.
Yeah, completely agree, Andy. And in fact, I'm sure this will be taken up through this seminar series and more broadly. We're very passionate about leadership at all levels. So leadership are not just the titular leaders at the top of an organisation, but a really high functioning organisation has leadership at all levels and demonstrates that through each and every team. And I think there's a really powerful concept in that in and of itself, but it's particularly important in thinking about these sorts of systems approaches. And if I can go outside organisations, I actually think it's incumbent on us as citizens to think about how we react to news as well, and really checking ourselves to see if we are being as hypercritical about things that really, as you read them more carefully, are about people in good faith trying different things. So I think there is actually a requirement on us as citizens, as well as requirements on us as participants and leadership at all levels. Peter, final word from you?
Just one thought, and then one Maori proverb that I have found helpful. I think when we are talking about failing forward and being experimental and being willing to identify and manage risk, we often think about, a new policy, a new program, even a reimagination. In my view, failing forward is also about being willing to embrace risk as part of a process, of actually developing the policy and developing the program. I think we've got to be much more willing to, as I like to describe it, bring the front line into the back room. It's the back room where we as public servants often operate. We've got to be more willing, I think, to genuinely collaborate and make partners of both the organisations that are likely to be delivering the public policy and those citizens who are likely to be subject to it. Because by doing that, you often get unexpected results. I, as you know, do quite a bit of work with refugees. A particularly challenging group with refugees are people who arrive here between about 15 and 25 years of age. That group often fall between the floorboards and are least likely to be successfully integrated unless we get it right. So I had lots of meetings with very good public servants thinking how we could improve services. What I eventually did was to say, stop. What we will do is go out and train a group of 15 young refugees and pay them to go and hold consultations on our behalf, and then come back and meet the public servants themselves and to discuss what we might do better for young refugees. It was an epiphany for me, because what came out was something we had never discussed as public servants. What came out was putting aside individual programs or policies, that young refugees felt that every time they went to government, and no matter how much government tried to help them, it started to treat them as cases to be managed. And they hated that. Their view was, no, we just need help with information to be able to navigate this new system. So what came out of that was a quite different view. Now we've introduced, on a small scale, experimental, a quite different way of delivering services to young refugees, using employed young refugees being able to use social media, all the things that are dangerous. But that came out of that process. So it's process as much as programs and policies we need to fail forward if we're going to be innovative. And my Maori proverb, which I think is very pertinent to the discussion today, is this: I hear and I forget. I see and I remember. I do and I understand. I reckon that's not a bad guide to a public service willing to lean forward into risk.
Thanks very much, Peter. A big thank you to all of our panelists today. I really have appreciated the conversation. It's been good fun and incredibly informative. So thank you very much, Peter Shergold, Tina Waller and Andy Mervis. Thanks to the audience for coming. It's always good fun to be part of a broader conversation and to hear from you as we go as well. We hope to see you at the next event, which will be on the 13th of May, exploring the theme of learning to listen. Between now and then, we'd love you to access our Reimagining Government series website, which has material on today's topic, including case studies, interviews, and articles. We'd also love you to join our community of practice, which I plugged before, which you can do via the Reimagining Government website. We'll be hosting interactive sessions, conversations, networking opportunities to continue the conversation. That was a big part of the feedback from last year's seminar series. And so we're looking to expand the follow-up conversations that we can have. We'll be circulating a post-webinar survey. We're keen to learn as well. And so we hope people will take the time to fill that in. We value your feedback. And we'll write a short wrap-up blog on each event. And so keep your eye out for that as well. It will be on our micro site. So with that, thank you very much to our panel. Thank you very much to our audience. It's been good fun again. Look forward to seeing you through the chat on the community of practice. Thanks, everyone.